All right, guys. Good to see everybody tonight. Some nice weather outside. I just wish it would decide what it wants to be, So, we shall see. Y'all be turning to 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 2. And we're going to deal with something real easy tonight. Head coverings for women. Easiest thing in the world. It's just as plain as the nose on your face. It's an interesting thing. We are so far removed from some of the cultural issues of the New Testament that just comes across as so foreign to us sometimes. And it made perfect sense to them. That's what you always keep in mind when you get to these difficult texts. We read it and we're like, what in the world is going on here? But for them, it was they understood. So it wasn't a confusing thing for them. So here's what I found. For those of you who teach Sunday school, one of the things I have found over the years, when there's one of these difficult texts coming, because I've come across a lot of them, it's almost always the main principle is pretty apparent. Like it's easy to get the main application. Some of the details, we may be so far separated that we're not always 100% sure exactly what they're talking about in the detail. But when you back up a little bit, you're like, oh, well, whatever it was, here's the guiding principle in this. And then that's how you teach it, and that's how you preach it, that's how you apply it. This is one of those where you read it, and I'm going to read the whole thing here in a second, and you're thinking, what in the world is being talked about here? But then when you back up from it a little bit, you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. So let me read it to you. This is 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16. Paul writes, "Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, the woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman. And all things are from God. Judge for yourselves, is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. For her hair is given to her for a covering. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God." And then after that, the next paragraph is the long section about the Lord's Supper. So he only spends a little bit of time here. So we don't need to deal with this, right? It made perfect sense when I read that. Everybody's good? We all good? Okay. Yeah, it's one of those things that there's a principle here that the principle is, here it is, don't do anything to dishonor the Lord. That's the overarching principle that comes out of this text. We're not to do anything that brings dishonor on the name of Jesus. That's the application. So that's preview. We'll get there in 15 verses. So go back to verse 2. Paul said, "Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you." So he gives them a little bit of encouragement before he deals with this specific thing, beginning in verse 3. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ. The head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. And in context there, he means God the Father. You see the separation. So he says something there in the middle of verse 3 that is entirely biblical because he talks about it in Ephesians 5. And that is that the head of the wife is her husband. Let me read it to you. Ephesians 5, 22 through 24. You guys know these verses. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. One of the things that Paul is talking about in this paragraph is to take some of our 21st century language. He's talking about gender roles, if you want to use that language. And he's talking about biblical gender roles. Today people will they enjoy taking a gender role and flipping it. It's interesting. Donna and I love, science fiction, whether it be Star Wars, Star Trek, Battlestar Galactica, whatever, you name it. We've always enjoyed science fiction. And because of the way culture has gone, in say the last 10 or 15 years, every new sci-fi show, or if they're going to reboot an old show, they're all going to be edgy. And so what they do is they start switching the roles up. Where this person is normally would be a guy, well now the person in this place is a woman. And normally this might have been a woman in the past, now we've put a guy here. So that, and everybody, it's interesting to me how everybody ends up rebelling in the same way. There's conformity in the rebellion. And so it shows you most people aren't thinking for themselves anyway. Why did all hippies kind of look alike? I mean, are you actually rebelling when you belong to a group? It's something to think about. And so you've got some of that going on. So this idea of gender roles is something that's very on everybody's mind for us today. He's dealing with the same kind of stuff. Because if you'll remember in the fall, not in the season, but in Genesis 3, when sin came into the world, when God was talking to Eve, he talked to her about that conflict, that within the marriage, within that there was going to be that, she was going to desire one thing, but it was going to go another, sort of the battle of the sexes. That's a thing, and it's because of sin. It's not the way it was set up. God very clearly, he created Adam, and then he created Eve from Adam. Now never forget, and we'll read these verses earlier in a little while, Genesis 1, and that's the overarching idea. Genesis 1 says both men and women are fully created in God's image. We can never lose sight of that. But then within God's plan for how the family works, for how the church works, for how all those things function, there's a very clear designation. Here's the role for men. Here's the role for women. That's what Paul's dealing with here. And so it's not a new thing that people try to take all this stuff and go the opposite direction with it. We see that today. How many in the last 2 or 3 years, every woman of the year has actually been a man, who suddenly claims that he's a woman kind of deal. We watch Channel 3 in the mornings. And they're doing this thing, Great Women of Memphis or something, and I've been real nervous that one of them's going to be a guy at some point. But I think so far everybody's actually been a lady. But I won't be surprised if we get there. So he says, I want you to understand, this is verse 3 again, that the head of every man is Christ. So that's the hierarchy. The head of the wife is her husband. And then he reminds us that the head of Christ is God. Jesus submitted himself to the Father. Not my will, he said, but yours be done. So he gives us that example. So then he gives a specific application to their church in their time. And here's what it is. Verse 4. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. Now, Paul seems to mean, when he uses the word head, he means two things. He means it's not this dude's noggin, but also he has just said that man's head is Jesus. Same word. So he's saying two things at once, that if this man prays with his head covered, he's actually dishonoring his actual head because of what it pictures. But by praying with that head covered, he's actually dishonoring his head, who is Christ, the one who is in charge of him. So he's using a word play here and using a metaphor. Now, it's very interesting. In Corinth, as my understanding, there was within paganism, and you can still see this sometimes in, maybe certain movies or TV shows or whatever. There was actually a statue in Corinth of Caesar, of Augustus Caesar. And what some of the men would do when they were in pagan worship is they would take their togas and they would pull it up over their head. So it was often associated with pagan worship as well. And so you've got that going. So and remember, we've been dealing with in this book consistently, this church has got to get away from the paganism they were brought up in. It is very difficult to get beyond your raising, in other words. And it's a hard thing. So for instance, this is a side issue, but this will explain it to you. However you're raised, you tend to think that's normal, whether it's normal or not, because you don't know any different. However your home functioned when you were a kid, unless you really have another example, if you were in a bad situation, you probably think everybody's in a bad situation. This is why when the first time, if I'm doing a wedding for somebody, when I sit down with the bride and the groom, one of the first questions I say is, tell me about how your parents communicated. And I let the groom talk. And then I'll say to the bride, tell me how your parents communicated. And sometimes they're completely different. And I'll say, okay, here's where some conflict's going to come in, because you're going to expect it to go this way and you're going to expect it to go this way, and the two methods have nothing to do with one another. So we talk through that stuff because we have to realize those things. So here in Corinth, these people have been raised in a wicked, wicked place with all kinds of pagan worship, and this idea of a man covering his head, of pulling up his toga, was something that happened within pagan worship. So it would have been normal for them. What Paul is saying here is, no, do not do that, because when you do that, you're going to dishonor Christ. You're going to dishonor your head, your source, the one who is over you, the one who is in charge of you. Do not do that. So that was one of the problems that he had to deal with. So, verse 5, but every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Now, who's her head? Her husband. That's who we've just been told in a few verses ago. Her husband is her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. So if she had no hair at all, and they're going to talk about her hair, being her glory and all of that. So now he goes to the other thing. He says, so when she prays or prophesies. Now, understand, we're going to have one of the more difficult things to deal with in this book, or in other parts of the New Testament, is when we're told that women should be silent in the church. But we've also just been told that they pray and prophesy in the church. So what are we going to do with that? We'll figure it out when we get there. Don't worry. So it happens. That's part of it. But there has to be a symbol of understanding, and the head covering did this, that she was under the headship of her husband. He was under the headship of Christ. The whole family is under the headship of Christ. It's things done in the right way so that ultimately God is glorified. Verse 6, for if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. And some people say that there in Corinth, maybe a shaved head and very short hair sometimes was associated also with pagan worship, temple prostitution, that sort of thing. So there were some cultural things going on there. I'm not sure how far we can press length of hair as far as that goes. You don't want the preacher walking around with a ruler, measuring sideburns kind of thing, because you hear those stories. I'll tell you one of the worst legalistic stories I ever heard. And a guy told me, I'm sure I've told you this because it's just so incredible to think about. But there was a pastor, I don't even know this pastor, I just knew a guy that was on staff with him. This was 30 years ago. And there was a lady who was going to sing. She was going to do a solo. And the pastor had it in his mind about a very specific skirt length. And so standing in the back of the sanctuary before church is this lady and a couple of the staff members, and the staff members are trying to determine, is her skirt length sufficient? And I'm picturing this poor woman standing there dealing with this stuff, and the pastor's like going, well, it's close, it was really, the guy who's telling it was very animated, You don't want to get off into that sort of thing as far as legalism goes and make applications for things like hair length here that are very much cultural to this, right? Because hair length changes over time, and it's not always in a way that dishonors Christ or dishonors, your husband or dishonors your wife. Those things that goes back and forth. The principle here is, what are you doing as far as how God has set up how we're supposed to function? That's the principle here. It's not whether or not your hair is necessarily short or long for us as far as the application goes. It was for them, just because of the association with it. Verse 7, for a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. Now, take that out of context, ladies, and you can be like, wait a minute, what in the world? But he keeps going. Verse 8, for man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Paul is going to appeal to the beginning. And he goes back to this in several places. In fact, in Romans 5, he goes back to the fact that Adam was our representative. And it wasn't when Eve ate the fruit that you and I fell into sin. It was when Adam ate the fruit that you and I fell into sin. So here he's pointing out the fact that Adam was created first, out of the dirt, out of the clay. Eve comes from Adam. Now he's going to point out in a minute, now none of us have been born or have come into this world without, being born from a woman. So all that stuff works itself out. But Adam was created first, and Eve was brought on. Why? Because God looked around and he saw that there was no one there for Adam. In fact, let me read it to you. Genesis chapter 2, verse 20. It says, the man gave names to all livestock and to the birds of the heavens and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found a helper fit for him. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man. While he slept, took one of his ribs and closed it up with flesh. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. Then the man said, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. And just like man and woman have a similar sound in English, it does in Hebrew as well. It works out that way. Verse 24, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and shall hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So Paul appeals back to that Adam was created first and Eve was brought along to be the helper. What's the King James say? Help meet, that phrase there. So he appeals to that. And so verse 9, neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That's what I just read. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head. And then he says something that nobody knows what he means. Nobody. Because of the angels. If you went to 10 scholars, you'd find 5 different opinions, and the other 5 were copying off the first 5 you read. Nobody's 100% sure what he means by this. Some think that it means that the angels of the Lord observe us in worship. And so, we're not dishonoring the Lord in how we are handling ourselves in worship as the angels observe. Some people will say it's fallen angels and that they're tempted because these women are not honoring their head. We don't know. We just don't know. They knew, we don't. And it's one of those things we just got to say, I don't know. I'm not sure. Because the overall point isn't affected by it. It's just one of those deals where it's not talked about anywhere else. We don't have another verse we can bring in on it. It's kind of like baptizing for the dead that's mentioned one time with no explanation. We just don't know what it means. So verse 11, nevertheless, in the Lord, so saved people, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. When people get married, something theological happens. and that is they become one flesh. That's why divorce or the loss of a spouse is so painful, because you are actually a theological unit. Something happens. Something spiritual happens when somebody gets married. I know the world tries to dismiss marriage, and people, get married multiple times and all of that, but there's God created it. We were given marriage before sin ever came into the world. People were supposed to get married and have babies before we ever fell into sin. And so there's something about that. Something actually happened. So that's what he's talking about here, that we're not independent of one another. We've been given one another. Verse 12, for as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman. Why does that happen? Because the first couple married, or God created the first marriage, he told them to be fruitful and multiply. And all things are from God. So he's bringing all this in, right? Because he's going to worry, just like we are, that he doesn't want any of us to think that spiritually speaking, men are any better than women, or that women are any better than men. We're all created in the image of God. We have specific roles to fill. We're having this debate now within our convention about, female pastors and that sort of thing. So there's always this back and forth about our roles. That's what he's doing here. He's dealing with that. Verse 13, judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? And the way he words that, and the way he expects their answer is, it's not proper, because of what he's been saying. Verse 14, does not nature itself teach that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. For her hair is given to her for a covering. And that's what he's been talking about, that symbol of authority. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, so he says, don't fight about this. We have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. So he's dealing with the gender issue. He's dealing with roles within the church. He's dealing with the relationship between a husband and a wife, particularly in the setting of public worship. One of I came across this in a couple of places. A couple of guys who know more than I do and are, it's their calling to study the New Testament, the culture and all that, have said, hold on, let me call for a second. They pointed out that early churches, right, the first church building didn't crop up until like the year 300-ish. There was no church building at all until 300 something, right? They always met in houses or out in the open air or whatever. One theory is, one of the reasons this became a problem is because the setting for church was a house, that some of these head covering things people might have assumed it was more relaxed than what was expected. Because it is a public gathering, but you might be in, somebody's house to do it. You might be you might be meeting in somebody's kitchen or something. And so maybe that's where things started to get out of hand. Like, well, we're not out, we're not at the temple doing this, and we're not, we're at so-and-so's house. So do I need to do all the stuff? And what he's dealing with here is, yes, you do, because this is the church gathered. This is them coming together for formal worship, which he's going to talk about with the Lord's Supper here in a minute, about how when they come together, they're not doing things correctly. So there is some thought that maybe this started because people made some assumptions because they were in homes rather than in a public place, that they didn't do the head coverings like they should have. All conjecture, but an interesting idea. But did y'all know that? We didn't have any church buildings till like around 300 or so. I mean, it took a long time before there were actually, formal, where you can recognize it. That's a building set aside for Christianity. And so buildings are a blessing. It's interesting. Adam and I were talking, or maybe Joe Dot and I, or Adam and I don't know, we're talking the other day about church planters. We can look at church plants, and because this is a side issue, by the way, it has nothing to do with this, but buildings is where I'm going. We'll look at church planters, and they're so outwardly focused, and they do such a good job of reaching people. But church planters look at us and think, wow, they've got a building. They don't have to set up every week. They don't have to do, so both of us, we all look at one another and think that looks fun, and well, that looks better, that sort of deal. But church buildings are a blessing, but we don't have to have one. I mean, you can meet and have a church without having a building. There's my understanding is if you drive around certain parts of Collierville, you'll see a large population of people from India. Some of our Awana kids come from that population, and it has to do with the FedEx place down here and all of that. My understanding is within that community, there's a pretty good house church movement. Like they're believers, and they worship together in homes and in apartments and all of that. So in certain parts of the world, church is house church. They don't have buildings, or they're hiding somewhere. And I've preached in houses before. I remember preaching in a house, and I stood the rooms were like this. It was the dining room and the living room, and I stood where they came together, and I had whatever, I had my Bible on, and I would look at them, and then I would look at them. And because it was a brand new church, they didn't have anybody to preach. There was a group that had broken off from another church, and I preached for that group several times before they finally ended up in a building. But I preached in that living room and dining room, and then one week I preached in like a garage apartment, and everybody brought a lawn chair. It was kind of bring your own chair to church kind of thing, but we did everything. We did, we sang, I preached, we gave the invitation, we prayed, we did. I think we might have even had the Lord's Supper one week, but we were just in somebody's house. So anyway, you don't always need the stuff, but that is some idea of maybe where some of this came from. So back to point. What do we do with it? Well, he's dealing with gender roles, and this is something as the church we can't compromise on, because the world has compromised on it and has flipped it on its head. And so it's an important thing. It's especially, as I said, within our denomination right now of churches trying to ordain women, have female pastors, that sort of thing. And y'all, I've got 4 girls, and I've told my girls all their life, they can do anything they want to do and be anything they want to be, except for 2 things. They can't be a dad, they can't be a pastor. Anything else, they're good. Like I said, they can be president, they can be a world dictator, whatever. But they can't be pastor, and they can't be a dad. Although in 2023, people will try to say they can be a dad, but we know better. So we can't compromise on the gender roles because it sets us apart. And it shows that we actually believe the Bible, and we actually believe what it says, and we're not caving to culture. The larger implication here is we've got to make sure that anything we do, and here for them it was whether they covered their head or didn't cover their head, that what we do does not dishonor what God has placed over us, whether that's the spouse and ultimately Jesus. So we've got to watch. So let's make the application. When is this happening? It's happening in church. So the specific application is whatever we do in the context of coming together to worship as the body, that we don't do anything that dishonors the Lord. That's why he's going to say and get off in 1 Corinthians about things that are supposed to be done in order. Things aren't supposed to get out of hand. The church kind of got out of hand a little bit. That's why he's going to spend so much time on things like tongues and spiritual gifts and that sort of deal. I know and there's a lot of different kind of church cultures, and I'm convinced God has given us so many denominations because we have so many different personalities. Like you can pretty much find a denomination that matches up with you. If you're real academic and you're going to love Presbyterians, Bible believing ones. Don't hang out with the liberal ones. If you're heart first and head second, you might sort of lean more towards kind of charismatic Pentecostal kind of thing. Baptists are right in the middle on those 2 things, and we always have been. we've always had two streams in Baptist life, of the more academically minded and then more of the more emotional centered kind of thing. We've had both of those from day one, and a lot of times we butt heads, and we tend to go from one church to the other. So we're right in the middle on that. But you can pretty much find one that matches a Bible-believing denomination that kind of fits with who you are. And I think the Lord has allowed that to happen, because you can find good folks who believe the Bible that, sort of match up with you. So we have to keep that in context when we think about how do we dishonor or honor the Lord in worship. There are places where you and I would feel uncomfortable, where the people who are doing it for God's glory and aren't dishonoring the Lord at all. But you and I just aren't like, this is not my thing. And so we got to make sure we don't say that's dishonoring to God because, whatever, preachers wearing flip-flops or whatever. I don't know. I'm just picking something silly. But we've got to be careful about that cultural kind of stuff. But we got to make sure that everything we do within, specifically here, corporate worship, is honoring to God. So the songs we sing, those of you, all right, let me give you an example. Those of you who are musicians, and this will be my last point of application, we have very talented musicians in our church. We have an amazing choir. There's a slippery slope between singing your best to glorify God and performance. It's real easy. And it's easy for us as a church because we want to encourage you, right? We want to, and we say, hey, you did a great job. But if you're up here, and preachers are the same way too, if you're up here for the accolades, if you're in there for the accolades, then that's dishonoring the Lord. But if you're using your talent to bring glory and honor to Him, you're honoring the Lord. And so you can take something that's good and end up making it something that's sinful. So it can be, and the more talented you are, like if somebody's a really gifted speaker, somebody's just an amazing speaker as a preacher, then it's real easy to like the slaps on the back. And some churches cheer now. I don't like that, so y'all don't ever do that. Not that I would say anything you would cheer, but it just strikes me as odd when I hear that, But I guess for them, if your heart's in the right place. But that just seems a little weird to me. But it's real easy to start believing your own press kind of deal. And you got to be careful, and you can end up dishonoring the Lord in that. So whatever we do within the context of corporate worship, which is what this is, we need to make sure that we are honoring the Lord. Well, guys, that is, and I talked longer than I meant to, 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16. Next week, we get into, and it may take us a couple weeks to go through it, or we might be able to do it all in one, 17 through 34, which is the long section about the Lord's Supper. And the fact that some of the people in the church at Corinth had died because they weren't doing the Lord's Supper correctly. And so, heads up, we're having the Lord's Supper on April 2nd. So, be sure you're in a good spot spiritually when we have the Lord's Supper. So, for those of you who are watching us online, if you're on Facebook or on YouTube, thank you all for being here. We appreciate it. If you have any questions, send me an email, John, John, at mycbcc.org, and hopefully I can answer any questions that you might have. But we're going to log off now and go